So now that we have talked about what biodiversity is and why it's so important for us, and all of the benefits that humans can reap from it, and not just humans, the planet can get from it, we can talk about how we are losing biodiversity and ultimately leading to extinction. So because we're changing ecosystems as humans, we're modifying the landscape of the world around us, and that's creating winners and losers, is what your book calls it. So some plants and animals are winning with this change, and some are losing. So humans have a tendency to change ecosystems so that they're more similar to each other. If you look around where humans live, the landscape that we create, streets and grassy areas and parks and high rises and farms and all of that, they look more similar to each other than the natural habitats that would have been there. And they're more open in structure. So remember that we talked about how differences in structure are good for an increase in biodiversity, like forests have more biodiversity than grasslands. And we're obviously creating more pollution. So this favors generalists. Remember that generalists are species that can eat a lot of things, live in a lot of different areas, are hardy. They're not vulnerable to one thing changing and them falling, and them not being able to survive with that change. So now we're favoring generalists because they can adapt to the changing conditions, and it harms specialists that rely on mature, stable ecosystems. So these ecosystems have had time to develop and evolve together for thousands or millions of years. And so any given species has been co-evolving with another species of plant or another species of animal for millions of years, and suddenly when we change them, now that tight-knit relationship is gone and they can't survive with something else. So we're harming specialists and favoring generalists. So the generalists would be the winners and the specialists would be the losers. So the organisms that benefit from human development tend to be geographically widespread, so we would find them across the whole globe. Small and fast reproducing, so probably more of an R selected species than a K selected species, and lower on the food chain. So the winners would be generalists, found in a lot of places, so that if they're gone from one place, they can still thrive in another. Users of open, early successional habitats, so as we tear down natural habitats, succession is going to happen, and so if they can thrive in the early stages of succession, they'll be more likely to. Able to cope with rapidly changing conditions, small and fast reproducing, again, are selected. Low on the food chain, not in need of large areas of habitat. If they can live between buildings, they're more likely to survive than if they need acres and acres. And usually mainland species, because island species are more vulnerable to extinction, which we've talked about before. So if in this example, the winner would be the house mouse, is a small, fast reproducing generalist mammal that thrives by living and feeding in or near our buildings, whereas a loser would be the tiger, which is a large, slow reproducing mammal. They have small clutch sizes, meaning they only have a few babies at a time. They live for a long time. They need large areas of mature habitat full of prey and full of people. So if I look out my window or around my building in Playa del Rey, I'm likely to find a lot of these. Not a lot of these. Haven't seen any tigers around here recently. So biodiversity loss comes as population sizes decline. So as populations shrink, they lose both genetic diversity and geographic range. So basically, as the populations shrink, now there's less diversity among them, and they're now losing the space that they live in. So both of these make the population vulnerable to further decline. So it can be a kind of a positive feedback loop. So the United Nations Environment Program developed what's called a Living Planet Index, where they studied all the different numbers of species, and they use it as a way to express how large the average population size of one given species is now compared to 1970. And they chose 1970 as the baseline year. So now it's been 48 years. Looking at how big an average population size, so a population of anything, of mice, of rats, of owls, of wildcats, whatever it may be, how many are in each population. Remember that a population is a group of one species living and interacting with each other in one place. How big those populations are now compared to 1970. And so what they saw is that the Living Planet Index fell by 52% from 1970 to 2010. So meaning that the average population size was 52% smaller than it was in 1970. And different types of habitats were affected differently. Freshwater habitats were affected the most. Saw the biggest decline. And then that's the average. Terrestrial wasn't as much. And it also changes based on where they are. So the tropical ecosystems were affected, I think, up to I don't remember the number. The tropical ecosystems were affected by a lot more than the temperate ecosystems because that's where there's more biodiversity and there are more specialists there, like we talked about. So extinction is what happens when all of the individuals of a given species are gone. And it occurs when the last member dies and the entire species ceases to exist. So as you could probably tell, extinction is irreversible. This isn't Jurassic Park. We cannot recreate and have healthy members of extinct species. And extirpation is when a population of one species in a particular area will go extinct. So when a species becomes extinct from an area, but not from the whole world. So this map shows the black rhino. And so the former distribution is shown in these orange regions where they used to live, and now it's only found in these specific areas. So it has been extirpated from all of those other regions. It's not yet extinct, but it's not found in most of the areas it used to be found in. So human impact is responsible for most extirpation and extinction today. We know that. We know that humans, and we'll talk about how humans have really, really affected and increased extinctions, but it does happen naturally. Extinction is a natural process because the environment is ever changing, all the species are ever changing, all of that. And if extinction didn't happen naturally, then we would be surrounded by dinosaurs and trilobites and woolly mammoths and all those things that have gone extinct, right? So extinction is a natural process. Humans did not cause dinosaurs to go extinct. But so the way that we measure the natural extinction rate is called the background extinction rate. And so that's the pace at which organisms independently go extinct. So without outside factors without humans affecting them, how over the history of life on Earth, the rate at which species usually go extinct. And so scientists have discovered this by looking at the fossil record, and they estimate that it's about 1 out of every 1 to 10 million, it's a pretty big range, mammal and marine animals go extinct each year. So at the most, 1 out of every million, at the least 1 out of every 10 million. That's the background extinction rate that has happened slowly over the course of life on Earth. And then there have been 5 times in the history of life on Earth where extinction has happened at a rate faster than that. And we call them the 5 mass extinctions. And there are 5 that eliminated at least half of the species that were found on Earth at the time. So the first one, a lot of them, we don't know much about them. We don't know the cause. It was mostly marine organisms. We didn't know about how many terrestrial organisms went extinct. There's 2 that are important to remember. One is the Permian extinction here, which calls it the Permo-Triassic extinction. That one said it's maybe a volcano that caused it to go extinct, but 80 to 95% of species went extinct. So as little as only 5% of the life on Earth continued through that. So that was the most devastating mass extinction in the history of the Earth. Then there was the Cretaceous. Then there was another mass extinction, which is when the dinosaurs went extinct. And so scientists have said that it might have been an asteroid impact. They're not entirely sure, but you probably can't see this here, but more than 50% of species went extinct. So that was the other big one that scientists, well, there's 5, but those are the 2 that come up the most. Then some scientists say that we are currently in the midst of a 6th mass extinction event due to human impacts. And so that would be the current mass extinction. Started at 0.01 million years ago. So that would be 10,000 years ago when humans started changing their environments and causing extinctions. So currently the extinction rate is 100 to 1,000 times greater than the background extinction rate. And your book gives a long list of the different animals that have gone extinct and or are possibly going extinct. But this says that this includes many North American birds, such as the ivory-billed woodpecker. So because of our impacts, we have caused lots of species to go extinct. And this is for reasons actually, we'll talk about the reasons. So the International Union for Conservation of Nature maintains what's called a red list, which is where we list all endangered and threatened species. So they redo it every few years and take a look at the numbers of different species and see where they will fall on the list. So in 2016, the red list reported these animals were threatened with extinction. That 22% of mammal species were threatened, 13% of bird species, 20% of reptile species, 31% of amphibian species, and 16% of fish species. And for the other groups of organisms like bacteria and insects and things like that, they didn't have enough data to make a global assessment. But if you'll notice that the 31% of amphibian species is the highest percentage of threatened species, and we'll talk about why amphibians are particularly susceptible to extinction. So this map shows how humans arrived at different parts of the planet and the extinctions that happen after that. So, for example, in the middle there, humans arrived in North America 10,000 to 11,000 years ago, and that we have now lost 72% of large mammal genera. Genera is the plural of genus, which is the level of organization just above species. So species is the most specific. The genus is the one above that. So, for example, in the species name Homo sapiens, Homo sapiens is our species name, but Homo is our genus name. So there are no other living species of the Homo genus, but that's what that's referring to. So it encompasses more than just species. Same thing in Eurasia when humans arrived there more than 30,000 years ago. 36% of large mammal species or genera went extinct when humans arrived on the Pacific Islands. So your book talks about how when humans arrived in Hawaii, when the Polynesians got there, how tons and tons of bird species went extinct. It says 50+% of endemic land bird species went extinct on the Pacific Islands. In Australia was hit specifically hard with 88% of large mammal genera going extinct. So it's been a pattern that as humans arrive in new places, extinction follows shortly after. And there's several major causes of that that humans have done. So the first one is habitat loss. And as you can guess, as humans build homes and farms and all of those things, we are disrupting the habitat that was there before. We have altered, degraded, or destroyed habitat through urban sprawl, which is the building of cities, farming, because we go from maybe a diverse landscape and plant a monoculture farm. Now that's much less diverse, much less supporting much less biodiversity. Grazing, where we would change a diverse landscape into grazing land for animals, clearing forests, and damming rivers. So through all of those things, we're affecting the habitats, and then the species no longer have a place to live and thrive, which can lead to extinction. And so habitat loss most commonly occurs through gradual piecemeal degradation called habitat fragmentation. So basically, little by little, it's not like we're wiping out huge whole masses of land, which does happen, but usually this is the less obvious way that it happens. So the original habitat will start to form gaps, and then that gaps, it's kind of a positive feedback loop. They get bigger and bigger until the species might eventually disappear due to habitat fragmentation. And so your book talks about a proposed highway through the Serengeti in Africa, and that would have caused a lot of habitat fragmentation. Habitat loss has affected every biome, with wetlands being specifically threatened. So wetlands are a aquatic biome that we didn't talk about, but wetlands have been really, really affected by habitat loss. And habitat loss is the primary source of the population declines in more than 80% of threatened birds and mammals. So as we see population declines in different species, 80% of that is due to habitat loss. So percentage of habitat loss is especially the temperate grassland, the chaparral, the temperate deciduous forest, and a lot of this is being lost because of deforestation for farmland. Another reason that we're losing biodiversity is because of pollution. So pollution harms organisms and leads to extinction in a lot of different ways. One, air pollution degrades forests and affects atmosphere and climate. So the forests are being degraded due to the pollution. They can't live and thrive because of the pollution in the air, the pollution in the water. Noise and light pollution affect the behavior and habitat use of animals. So if suddenly there's a new city someplace, that might affect the mating or the ability of different species to find food because now there's light and noise. Water pollution directly harms fish and amphibians. Agricultural runoff affects the food webs of aquatic ecosystems. An example of that would be dead zones through cultural eutrophication. Persistent pollutants like heavy metals directly poison people and wildlife. So if heavy metals get into water, then they move up the food chain and they poison people and wildlife. And then plastic in the oceans can strangle, drown, or choke marine animals. So each of these things can specifically lead to individual animals dying, which then, if that amplifies, will lead to extinction of a species. Our growth in population and consumption is also leading us to remove species at faster rates than they can reproduce. And I'm going to pause there.